And I particularly like this version because it doesn't have any chapter section headings, which is normally what is used to break up the text. So you can read this as one discourse which Jesus gave. And that's extremely important because the verses we're particularly going to look at about salt and light must be seen in the context of what's before and what's after. So we can see something of this of the flow and the continuity. So I'm just going to try and whiz through this these verses, but mostly focus on verses kind of 13 to 16. So the first bit is about the Beatitudes, and talking about the new way that God is defining in Jesus what it means to be God's people, and that Jesus is giving these different ways of being blessed, a kind of a very countercultural way, subversive way. Lots to say about that, but I'm not going to talk about the Beatitudes. But just to say that at the end of the Beatitudes, so verse 11 says, "Blessed are you," because he's talking to his disciples, okay? These are those people who've already made the choice to say, I want to be part of what you're doing and to follow Jesus, okay? So he's talking to the disciples and saying, "Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So right, he's now saying that you're going to be persecuted for following Jesus, being disciples of Jesus, and part of this new kingdom, in the same way that the prophets were persecuted in the past. So he's saying, here's a connection, a continuity between the life and the work and the ministry of the prophets in the Old Testament. Now, what kind of things did the prophets do? Prophets were there to, in some ways, represent God and God's standards and his word and his principles to the people, but also to really speak a word of, if you like, truth and justice, and to kind of hold people to account. So there's that prophetic role that the church, Jesus says, is going to have as well. And then he says, "You are the salt of the earth." That comes immediately after this connection with the prophets in the past and with the fact that it's going to be tough. You're going to be persecuted. Not everyone is going to welcome your message. But you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its taste, how can it be restored? It's no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. We decided about 2 years ago we were going to take Jubilee Centre to a big Christian camp and try and tell people about our work. And we thought, this has got to be done visually. And so I thought, let's use the salt and light analogy. It's a great analogy. Let's take that and see if we can find something new. So we bought this amazing chunk of salt, Himalayan rock salt. And of course, very clever, boom, salt and light. And but in doing that, I thought, let me look a bit deeper into the salt, because we very easily say, oh yes, we're doing salt and light in our Christian engagement with society. But what does it really mean? What was Jesus wanting us to understand? Let's first think about what this would have meant to the first century hearers. What was salt used for? It had three major purposes in the first century, okay? Primarily, perhaps, or the first one, is it was used to preserve fish and meat from decay, okay? Before the days of refrigeration, in a tropical, Middle Eastern kind of climate, you know, things go off quickly. So salt was an absolutely vital way to stop decay, okay, and to preserve things in a healthy and a good state. Secondly, salt was used for adding flavor, and it, as we know now, nutrition, it's absolutely vital for the biochemical balance within our bodies that we have a certain amount of salt. So it adds flavor, and it's a really important nutrient, isn't it? And thirdly, salt has amazing antiseptic properties, so it could be used for treating wounds and for in medicine effectively. So when Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, and as people reflected on what that might mean, there will be this sense, okay, well, what does it mean then for the church to be salty in society, for God's people to be salty in these three ways? Well, so the first way is to try and, if you like, stop the rot, to stop corruption, stop decay, stop the advance of evil and sin and injustice and abuse and so on. And there's always been, throughout the history of the church, and it's not only Christians who do this, because there's the sense of, we're all made in God's image, and there's a deep sense of right and wrong. All kids know very early on when things are right or whether things are wrong, and if they're fair or not fair. And if you've got children, one of their most popular words at a certain age is, it's not fair. Kids understand this. There's a deep sense of justice, and we know when there's injustice going on. So the church has had and goes on having this role to try and, if you like, stop the rot. But that's only one side of it. And if that's all we did, then it would be understandable for people to really criticize the church and say, oh, you're just against everything, when you speak up in public life, you're against this, you're against everything that is fun and enjoyable. Well, fascinatingly, the second use of salt is to add flavor, to add something good. And I believe this is this is really one of the things that dawned on me really clearly a couple of years ago, that our role is to affirm what is good and what is right. And this is an extremely valuable ministry, if you like, that Christians can have in public life, is to affirm when others do something that's good and right, whether they're Christians or not, or from another religion. To say, that is good. That is something, you're expressing something that's good and right according to the character and the ways of God. To say, this is really positive. And we're called to bring that positive contribution into public life. And yes, it could be in the arts, it could be in all sorts of different areas. One little story I love to tell, some of you have heard this before, but as an example of this, just in a personal anecdote, this was somebody in the United States back in the, 1890s or something. And he was he was a pastor of a church, and he was taking the train between two towns in the States, and the guy in the carriage with him was clearly a little bit worse for the wear, and he had his hip flask, and he kept having a swig of whatever he was drinking. And he started to say to the pastor, "Here, have a drink," and the pastor said, "No, thank you," and he repeated this 2 or 3 times. And the pastor said, "Thank you, but no." And then the drunk guy said to him, "I bet you're thinking, what an evil man I am, that I am addicted to alcohol." And the pastor said something remarkable. He said, "No, I wasn't thinking that. I was actually thinking what a generous man you are, that you've offered me a drink these 3 times. Well, that was so unexpected that this guy almost immediately sobered up, or enough to start talking to the pastor. And by the end of that train journey, the drunken man's life had been turned around, and he had come to Christ and had recognized, well, what was it? It wasn't any amount of preaching. It was no condemnation. It was this affirmation of the one thing that he could see that was positive in that man's life. And he said, that was a good thing. You're a generous man. So how many ways can we have an impact, a positive impact in public life, by affirming what is good? Now, of course, if we only ever affirm what is good, that is only half of the story too. But the third use of salt, of course, was to bring healing. And in society, where does our society need healing? Well, there's so many ways where there's brokenness, where there's relationships breaking down. And I think it is primarily around, or in the area of relationships, that the church is called to bring reconciliation, to be peacemakers, as we saw in earlier in the chapter. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. So there's this calling to making peace. Now, right away, Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, it's no good for anything. So immediately he gave this extraordinary expression of the calling of the church, but then warned that you can lose your saltiness. Now, physical salt, that is always going to act and behave and taste like salt. But the church can lose its saltiness. Now, how is that? Salt, just think about it like this. Salt physically, those three uses of salt, they only can have their effect if the salt is in direct physical contact with the thing it is seeking to change or to transform. If it's not in direct, it may have all the wonderful powers to preserve or add flavor or bring healing, but if it is not in direct physical contact with what it's supposed to change or transform, it is useless. So I think that is also something that's quite profound, because when the church, with all its potential to be salt in society, if we withdraw and say, no, we don't want to get involved in that because it's too difficult, it's too much corruption, it's too, different stories in different parts of church history, we give these various reasons why not to be engaged and involved in the world around us. We lose our saltiness. We stay, all very nice to look at, but completely useless. Okay? And the other way I think the salt can lose its saltiness is on the other end of the spectrum, where if we get so involved and so engaged and so much part of what we are seeking to transform that we lose our own distinctiveness and we become, indistinguishable from what we're trying to change. And I think when we look back at church history, or even our own church, or perhaps even our own Christian walk, there are perhaps times when we've either stood right at back and not wanted to get involved, or we've gone the other way, and you start to think, am I really any different from, as a Christian, or is our church really distinctly different from the world around us? So those are some really key things I think about salt. Then he comes on, Jesus talks about light. Okay. He says, you are the light of the world. And he gives then two different illustrations of that. He says, a city on the hill cannot be hidden. And secondly, that if you light a lamp in your house, you put it up on a shelf or a stand so that it casts its light. You don't hide it away underneath a basket. Okay? So he's talking about two sort of expressions of light. As we thought about this, we thought, okay, what must that mean? The city on a hill, again, in New Testament times, when would you see the light of a city on a hill? The lights. It would be in the dark. Okay? In nighttime, you'd be walking, you'd be finishing your journey, and you'd see, I can see the lights of the houses clustered together on the hillside. That's my destination. That's where I can find shelter and safety. And I think that's the suggestion to me is that this cluster of lights, if you like, represents the witness of the church when it's gathered together. Okay, the corporate witness of the church being gathered as a cluster, if you like, a cluster of lights. But then Jesus uses the other sort of individual illustration of putting the lamp on a stand in the house. And the suggestion there is that is the, if you like, the witness of your lives. And remember what, I should read the verse 16 as well. In the same way, let your light shine before others so they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. And so it's about how we live our lives and so that people can see us. So it's corporately, the city on the hill, what we do together with other believers as the church, as local church, national church, Christian organizations. It's what we do corporately and collectively. Okay? The lamp in the household is I think it's our sort of domestic and local witness as an individual or as a family or your household. And I think a big part of that is being a good neighbor. It's hospitality, especially. Because you may not be able to be involved in any big issues in public life, but you are going to have some neighbors. Almost everyone is going to have some neighbors. And you can offer hospitality. You can build relationships. You can be a light at that local, personal, individual scale. So, if the light, when Jesus says you're the light of the world, to the church, and that refers to their corporate witness and their household or individual witness. That's what they do as Christians. I think salt, the work of being salt is what we do individually as we are going about our work, our occupation, our profession, whatever that may be. And I think that saltiness is particularly for the scattered church. You see, the light is for the gathered church in the household or in the local congregation. The salt is scattered. It doesn't do well if it's all in a cluster. Light needs to be kind of, sufficiently bright to be together. But salt needs to be dispersed. So I think the mandate of salt, the three things we looked at, is to be carried out particularly by individuals wherever you are, wherever you're placed, in whatever your spheres of influence, your profession, your workplace, your neighborhood, your community. All right. So I think from that, just these three little verses, salt of the earth and the light of the world, there is, I think, if I could, a kind of an embryonic mandate for Christian social engagement. And we wrote a booklet about this last year. It's on the table there. We can get some more copies. Called "Shining in the Sun: A Biblical Vision for City Transformation," and the kind of the fourth part of that, strategies for engagement, is really what I've been talking about, and we go in quite a lot more detail into it. So you can read more about this through this booklet. But the last thing to say is, well, what kind of what is the manifesto, if you like, for this social engagement? And that's where Jesus then says, immediately after this, remember there's no paragraph breaks in the Greek, He says, "Do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And we had a great discussion in the office this morning around these verses and about what it meant. Now, I won't say any more now, because we're going to, when Michael Schluter comes tomorrow morning, he's going to talk about a biblical framework for Christian social engagement, and he'll talk about the role and the place of biblical law, which is what Jesus is referring back to. But just to say, there's this wonderful connection here in Matthew 5, where Jesus is saying, he's talking about the continuity of the church with the role of the prophets from the Old Testament, and he's talking about the continuity of the law, which he is saying, I've not come to abolish it, but I've come to fulfill it, to express it in a whole new way. And he goes on then in the rest of Matthew 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, where he said, you've heard that it was said this, but I tell you that. In those contrasts, he's saying there's an external conformity to the law, which is really what the Pharisees and others at the time were really majoring on. It's all about looking right on the outside. Jesus radically internalizes it, and is saying in his own life and through the church, we're to show what God's wisdom and his ways and his character look like as it's worked out in all sorts of different areas of life, because biblical law does touch on all kinds of areas of public life. And we've got, for example, the banner at the back there, seeking biblical wisdom for major themes in contemporary society. The choice of those 8 themes there are ones that we drew from the emphases of biblical law, for example. So you'll get to hear more about this as we go through the summer school. But I just want to encourage you to start. We love, even though people say, "Oh, Jubilee Centre, you talk an awful lot about biblical law. Isn't that Old Testament? Isn't that, aren't we in the New Testament now?" Start here with Matthew 5 to find these key connections, the continuity of the Old and the New, and of the mission of the church. The mission of Israel as a nation, God's model society, now incorporated into the mission of the church as God's model people. So there's lots more to say about that. But anyway, we want to just begin with this, looking at Scripture together, because this is our starting point. This is our authority. It's where we try and, we don't come up with ideas for engaging in society that are not somehow reflected in the Scriptures. So for Jubilee Centre, we have a high regard for the Bible, but we draw wisdom from all sorts of different strands of the church. So not only the kind of evangelical, but also from other strands, other traditions as well. So I think that's a good introduction.
Thank you.
Get us started. Thank you, Philip.